Welcome everyone to the Linnean Society. And this is the first one of these nature readers that I've done, and I'm really excited to talk about this particular book, which is written by Samanth Subramanian. And I'd like to welcome everyone to the Society, because the Society is a place where everyone who's interested in nature can come together and look at ways to involve and inspire other people and everyone in understanding and valuing and protecting the natural world. So as that, we're a very broad church, and there's lots of people with lots of different interests. And what I'm hoping is from tonight, the depths of my non-understanding of population genetics and the wealth of understanding that Samanth has will come together and spark some questions from people that that Samanth can then go on and answer in the end. So we'll try to sort of leave enough time at the end for questions. So Samanth, would you like to start by just reading a part from your book?
That sounds good. Thanks, Sandy, and thank you all for having me. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about JBS, one of my favorite people of all time. I am going to read a short section from JBS's time during the Second World War. The background to this is that the British Navy had lost a submarine, and they needed to know a little bit more about how the human body responded to submarine conditions. And JBS, therefore, was given the task of finding this out, and this is how he proceeded to go about it. Once the Thetis, the submarine, was lost, the Admiralty recognized how much it still had to learn about the physiology of men underwater. Britain had just built 15 U-class submarines, and after the war started, another 34 would be ordered. So the government asked Haldane if he would look into this some more and study how humans responded to the demands of the deep sea. Haldane accepted. Over the next 5 years, he invariably mentioned in his letters that he was engaged in some rather serious war duties and so didn't have the time to write at length. He wasn't bragging, or only a little. More likely, he was treasuring the thought that this work had instant practical utility, the way his fathers did, and that he had been drafted into the battle against fascism. And perhaps he was enjoying the irony that he was working for a government he constantly and publicly criticized. Haldane drafted his own little battalion, Helen Spurway and his secretary, Elizabeth, Hans Kalmus, whom he had once settled as a refugee from Germany, Joan Negrin, the former Spanish prime minister, and at least a dozen others, including some accredited communists. Month after month, he introduced himself and his colleagues into Sieb Gorman's equipment, an unlit cylindrical chamber of steel, 8 feet by 4, from which a person could only communicate by tapping code on the walls by holding written messages up to the glass portholes. Within this chamber, Haldane was able to vary the pressure and the composition of the air. Separately, in a tall tank, one of his crew, wearing a Davis or a diving suit, could remain underwater for an hour or more. The memory of the Thetis shadowed these trials. All these British sailors encapsulated in submarines around the world, what would happen to their bodies in extreme cold or under intense pressure, or in this mixture of gases or that? How would they survive? In all, Haldane ran more than 100 tests. It was the most exhaustive, sustained spell of research into underwater physiology ever conducted by a scientist. In a systematic style, Haldane progressed through every scenario he could think of, every possible combination of gas, temperature, and pressure, every possible way in which these elements could pillage the body. In the Chamber of Horrors, as they came to call it, his colleagues were compressed and decompressed. They breathed blends of helium and oxygen, or oxygen and hydrogen, or oxygen and nitrogen. They breathed pure oxygen, a variety of concentrations of carbon dioxide. They breathed these when they were dosing themselves with benzodrine and when they were in atmospheres of high pressure, or when they were warm, or when they were plunged into ice baths. They appraised their ability to do regular things in irregular conditions, eat a meal, solve arithmetic problems, exercise with weights, or just maintain an even state of mind. They watched each other roll through confusion, anger, stupefaction, and suffering. From within the chamber, their senses muddling, they wrote out messages for the observers outside. Nose clip, very painful. I can't see anything. Eyepieces so dimmed. Why did you trick me? The experiments were always edged with danger. A valve could malfunction, trapping a test subject in a haze of noxious air. An individual could react unexpectedly badly to a gas or to a shift in pressure. Lungs collapsed, noses bled, teeth ached. Eardrums clamored for mercy, and one of Haldane's perforated. If a hole remains in it, although one is somewhat deaf, one can blow tobacco smoke out of the ear in question, which is a social accomplishment, he said. On occasion, Haldane lost his memory for a span of time. Twice in high pressure conditions, he grew fidgety and anxious and then slipped into convulsions. They were, he wrote in a letter, like ordinary epileptic ones, and 2 or 3 minutes of kicking are followed by about 10 minutes of unconsciousness. He recovered into a state of high terror. The convulsions were so violent that they crushed 3 of his vertebrae. In another session, he damaged himself further. Having breathed a mix of helium and oxygen, he was waiting for the chamber's pressure to bleed down when his body erupted with pain. Then he felt a patch of skin above the back of his hip itch and tingle, as if his nerves were dancing. Later, he learned that a bubble of helium had formed in the conus at the very tip of the spinal cord. The injuries brought on Kummel's disease, where the bones in his lower back, starved of blood, turned necrotic. For the rest of his life, Haldane would need a cushion to intercede between himself and his chair.
Thank you very much. Extraordinary. I mean, it's. Can you imagine volunteering to do anything like that? I can't imagine. I wonder, you know, at the beginning of the book, you write about how he worked with his father a lot. And although he kind of rejected his family later on in a way, do you think that that early experience with his father doing experiments on himself really kind of set the scene for him to do that sort of thing later on in life?
Absolutely. I mean, I think his father and he were both united in the idea that you were your own best test subject. The logic was that a rabbit couldn't really tell you what it was feeling. And so it was best to experience these conditions, particularly conditions that had to do with physiology of the human body, to experience them yourself. But there was also a greater purpose, I think, and this was also something that both father and son shared. There was a greater sort of moral purpose here, which is that if you're doing these experiments, whether to find out if submariners can survive in these mixes of air or in these temperatures, or as his father did, to see what kind of conditions coal miners experienced, for example, deep down beneath the earth, it was only right that you shared those conditions temporarily and shared the experience of what it was like with these men who were undergoing the same conditions on a daily basis. And I think beyond that, there is sort of a bigger philosophy here, which is both Haldane Sr. and Jr. believed so deeply in the value of classlessness, which is remarkable for their time. They felt this bond with the working man and woman. And so putting themselves in these situations was in a way to experience or to show some solidarity with people who did this for a living, often with very little safety or very little heed paid to their safety.
Yeah, I think that was interesting, and something you wrote about how that he quoted William Watson saying, "I think discontent of one kind or another is the only cause of progress." But what I find interesting is that there was this great sympathy with the working man and woman, but yet Haldane, the Haldanes actually lived a life of privilege.
Absolutely. I mean, they came from privilege. They're an old Scottish family. And when JBS was born, his father was a professor at Oxford, and they lived in a spanking big house, the site of which is now occupied by Wolfson College in Cambridge. Haldane went to Eton. He went to Oxford, then taught in Cambridge. So these are all clearly sort of, they were drawn from one particular layer of British society. JBS, at least to his credit, as his life progressed, increasingly lived like the working man that he claimed to valorize. Very often his sister would visit him, especially after the 1930s, his sister would visit him and would see that he was living in small, cramped conditions, often utter squalor, because he was quite a messy guy. And when he moved to India in the late 1950s, he once again sort of lived exactly as his Indian colleagues lived for the most part. And so more than his father, I think JBS himself walk the talk in a way.
Yeah, so do you think that was part of his, because I found it interesting that you kind of talked a bit in the book about him rejecting his father and his parents, but then didn't elaborate. And so was that just kind of a gradual shifting away, or was it something more dramatic than that?
I think so. I mean, it was gradual in the sense that although they were born into quite, he and his father was quite liberal even when JBS was born. But then as JBS went through his own experiences, which was serving in the trenches in the First World War, um, uh, going through a period of time at Cambridge when the political temper was sort of quite left-leaning, as he got married to somebody who was an affirmed socialist, so his own progression politically happened over several years.
Mm-hmm.
And I think by the end of the 1930s and the early 1940s, you see him sort of as a fellow traveler of the British Communist Party. Of course, in the early 1940s, he becomes a card-carrying member. And that seals sort of his transformation leftward, so to speak.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting that he toyed a long time with becoming a member of the Communist Party. He toyed with that a long time, and he almost chose the worst time to do it, in the middle of the Stalinist purges, when it was really pretty ghastly.
That's true. Although, I mean, the only thing I can say in his defense is something that the historian Eric Hobsbawm has said as well, which is that in the 1930s, with the specter of fascism sort of draped across continental Europe, very often people did think that a communist solidarity or a socialist solidarity was the only way to counter that. Mm-hmm. And he had a very difficult, Haldane had a very difficult time explaining away this non-aggression pact between the Soviet Union and Germany, between Hitler and Stalin. Because if Stalin was supposed to be the great counterweight to Nazism, well, then what was he doing signing this non-aggression pact? And so, he offered a few extremely specious explanations for it. But I think he was quite relieved when the Soviet Union entered the war, and he could throw his weight unequivocally behind Stalin's armies.
Yeah, some of the things you quote in the book are really you can almost feel the palpable relief in him that everybody's finally on the right side. Everybody is on the right side. I also thought it was interesting, this kind of the kind of contortions that went on. And one of the things that I found interesting, partly because I've always had a really hard time understanding it, is his kind of his attempt to fit his science into dialectical materialism, and how that sort of it felt almost as though it was an intellectual exercise just for fun.
Right. I mean, it was that, but I guess it was also sort of a little propagandizing. I mean, so for people who would want to know a little bit more about dialectical materialism, this is sort of a lens, an all-purpose lens that Marx and Engels set down to scrutinize history and nature. The premise broadly and very basically being that the conditions of the material world give rise to everything. They determine all historical change, all social reality. And so you should also be able to see sort of science from the same angle. And again, as somebody who's very fond of JBS and of course a huge champion of him as his biographer, to his credit, he never tried to shape his own scientific work by the principles of dialectical materialism. That proceeded strictly according to the scientific method. Of course, he made mistakes as many scientists do, or most scientists do, but they weren't ideological mistakes. But what he did do for the purposes of, I guess propaganda is the best word for it, to convince his readers and his audiences that there was something valuable to be found within Marxism and dialectical materialism, is that he would try to repurpose scientific explanations so that they fit dialectical materialism, the principles of it. Mm-hmm. And these were the contortions that you talked about as well, that where he would offer tenuous explanations for example, why evolution is the way it is, trying to explain them through the prism of diamath. And I look at these partly for fun, as you say, they were done for fun, but partly also as a sort of intellectual and political exercise for himself, so that he could then go out there and convince. He was very evangelical about Marxism while he was a Marxist. And so this was part of his propagandizing, I guess.
Well, partly part of his self-training as well, because each of us, of course, trains ourselves in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I think also, and it really sort of exemplifies how, in his mind, science and politics were inextricably wedded, and that you couldn't separate them, however much you tried. Politics would impact science, and science will impact politics, and you can see science through the prism of politics, and vice versa. And these are lessons that I think maybe in the second half of the 20th century were forgotten to some extent. But during the time that Haldane lived, and he wasn't the only one to believe this, there was a really strong notion, or a really strong realization that science and politics were intertwined.
So why do you think that changed? Is it, I mean, there's all kinds of reasons why it might change, but this idea that science sits aside from society and exists in a kind of pure neutral sense, that it doesn't actually, that it almost is outside of a social context. I mean, I think the social context of science is definitely, it's always been there and people have always thought about it. But do you think that there was something that happened after the Second World War that caused that kind of wish for science to be almost in a box by itself?
Right. Well, I mean, it's we talked earlier about, definitely in the US, how scientists were persecuted for some of their political beliefs, or at least sort of heavily investigated and interrogated if they happen to believe too much in socialism or communism. So that might be one reason for it. I offer a couple of theories. I mean, I don't know if there's any one reason. One definitely is that, unlike with Haldane, who, as great a scientist as he was, never actually completed a degree in the sciences. I mean, the most scientific subject he got a degree in was mathematics. And so, but he studied the classics when he was at Oxford. That was his degree. And he read the classics extensively, and he read social science extensively. And so I think C.P. Snow's idea of these two cultures has a lot to do with it. The fact that scientists stopped being trained in the humanities to that extent as they became more and more specialized, meant that they also stopped thinking about their work in social terms. So I think that's one aspect of it. The other aspect is that as budgets grew for scientists to be able to do their work, they increasingly had to depend upon grants from governments or or corporations. And so you don't want to necessarily go out there making political statements against the very people who are giving you the money to do your work. And so maybe that's one part of it. There may be others as well. And I think we are slowly seeing a reversal of this now over the last sort of 6 or 7 years, as there's been sort of a real war on fact and a war on science in countries around the world. I think scientists are slowly sort of recovering their political voice in a way that they perhaps didn't have so much in the 1960s and 70s and 80s.
Yeah, so I think that's quite interesting, because you think about the kind of platform Haldane had through his Daedalus and all of the things he did, is he was incredibly listened to, and you almost can't imagine a scientist commanding that much cross-societal respect today.
I think that's right. I mean, I was trying to think about parallels to Haldane in a post-Haldane era. Scientists whom people would turn to even for wisdom or opinion about political or economic subjects, or about subjects that are not related to his own science. And I couldn't really come up with that many names. The most politicized scientific subject of late has been climate change. And I think that's definitely something that scientists have been willing to speak up on. James Hansen, formerly of NASA, is sort of one really strong voice in favor of strong climate change policies. But by and large, you don't tend to see too many figures of Haldane's stature who are speaking out today to that extent.
Well, also using the language that people who aren't scientists might connect with, quoting Horace and poetry and I mean, he was amazing. The number of different things he would just spout off. You know, you think, wow, that is amazing. And I think that's one of the things that as an American who came from a school system in which we don't specialize until we're probably in our late 20s, mid to late 20s.
Right.
I found it sad that my children weren't allowed to take the classics if they were going to be, you know, physicists or chemists.
That's exactly right. I mean, I talked to a number of scientists about this as well when I was researching the book, and they come up with the same idea, which is that increasingly each succeeding generation of scientists has to start specializing earlier and earlier. And there's obviously a very good reason for this. I mean, Haldane did his work at the very dawn of genetics, and there was a lot that a generalist with a mathematical aptitude like himself could do in that field. There was so much still to be discovered, and all sciences get more specialized with the passage of time. And so it isn't surprising that people have to start specializing, I don't know, in freshman year in university, or at least have to start thinking about what they need to study in the long term if they really want to become scientists, where they have to intern, which professors they have to work with, what are the skills they need to pursue one particular niche in science. So while it's unavoidable, I would love to see, I'm sure, a number of other modules in universities that cater to scientists like this, that give them a more broader, a more fleshed out sort of education.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and also the breadth. I mean, maybe so. The other thing that I thought was really interesting. I mean, the things that Haldane discovered, which we still talk about, like Haldane's rule and a whole number of things, is absolutely extraordinary. And it was a kind of golden age of the start of genetics, but also a really interesting time as well. And I thought it was, you know, people often mix up Haldane and Fisher, partly because they were in the same place at the same time, but also they were similarly crusty, as it were. But I found it interesting that and I hadn't known this until I read the book, is that during the Second World War, when London was being bombed and University College was sent away, Fisher invited Haldane to his lab in Rothamsted. And you know, you can't imagine two people of more diametrically opposed political beliefs actually getting on today. I mean, have we become less tolerant?
Not only that, but I honestly don't think they liked each other very much at all. I mean, even as people. But I think Fisher at the time must have seen sort of a greater good to inviting Haldane and his lab down to Rothamsted when they were evicted, in a sense, from UCL, and so gave them quarters at the experimental station over there. Haldane repaid this in some way later when he moved to Calcutta in the late 1950s. He invited Fisher down for lectures. And so I think there was an ability there to see that despite their political differences and even their personal differences, which are quite vast, they respected each other's work at a very fundamental level. Fisher would sometimes snark about Haldane's work, saying that he didn't understand why Haldane needed all that math, all those numbers. And so while there were sort of, you know, philosophical differences in how to go about this work, there was still a fundamental respect. And I think, you know, I was trying to think about the reason as to why you think that may not happen that much anymore. One is, of course, that, and this may be a blessing or a curse, depending on how you look at it, but the scientific establishment, by and large, the rank and file of working scientists seem to be more aligned on politics than they perhaps were in Haldane's day. In Haldane's day, I think you had the outright racists and the eugenicists, and as well as sort of the socialists and the communists. You had every part of the spectrum was filled and thickly populated. Fortunately for us, we don't, I assume we don't have that many people at the racist and extremist view of the spectrum, although I could be wrong about this.
Yeah, I don't know. I wonder if we've just become more homogenized, or science has actually become narrower.
Right. And maybe you just don't talk to that many scientists outside of one small circle that you work with. I mean, maybe also, despite the fact that we're all sort of more globalized now, the community is so much bigger that you tend to gravitate towards your own, so to speak.
Oh, maybe it's like food, because there's a paper that a colleague of mine did a few years ago where he was looking at looked at all the FAO statistics for food, and each person now in all countries, all people are eating more different kinds of foods,
Right,
but we're also all eating more of the same kinds of foods.
right.
So as well as becoming more diverse, our diets are actually becoming more homogenized, and maybe science is the same.
That's interesting. Yes, I mean, absolutely. And this also goes back once again to this question of specialization that we talked about earlier as well, which is that as you specialize, your niche tends to grow so much smaller to the extent that it's almost sort of a self-selected group of people that you've chosen to work with. And maybe the potential for you as a Haldane-like figure to be able to find and interact with a Fisher-like figure in the modern age is the potential for that is much smaller.
Yeah, possibly. But I think his kind of his ability to quote things, you know, to quote the classics, and you know, is partly his education, but also partly that he must have thought that was important enough to remember.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, of course, he was schooled he had a good schooling in the liberal arts, and obviously his father read a lot, and he himself had a prodigious memory to which things adhered without any effort. But he was curious about the world beyond his own science, and he would read avidly about it, and he would, and this would all stick, and he would genuinely think that the stuff was important. I mean, he once wrote a paper after Frisch wrote his big paper about the dance of bees. Haldane wrote a paper about comparing that to I think one of Aristotle's descriptions of dancing bees, and to kind of see how the science and Aristotle's theories sort of, tallied, or how they sync.
What had changed?
Yeah, it was a really short paper, but it clearly needed a deep knowledge of Aristotle and the ability to call that up the minute this new research came out from Frisch about why bees dance and how they dance. And it needed sort of the kind of mind that would connect these two laterally in a way that's quite difficult to do. He was really a very omnivorous sort of personality.
But I think that's possibly what a part of his appeal, because I was corresponding with a fellow of the society who's probably here tonight, and he said that he was inspired directly by some of Haldane's books that were written for children. That there were books that inspired people to become scientists, or inspired people to do things, and that to me is also something rare for a scientist. I mean, it's not unheard of course,
Right.
but for someone of that stature to sort of feel that it was that important to inspire everyone about science,
Right.
not just his fellow scientists.
And I mean, and not just that, but he also had this incredible facility to communicate. He was such a gifted writer. I mean, in some of my writing classes, I have often prescribed George Orwell's famous piece, Politics in the English Language, as a sort of primer on how to write clearly, and what to do and what not to do, and what the implications are of the choices that you make when you write prose. Haldane has a similar article called How to Write a Popular Scientific Article. And I think it should be made mandatory reading in any sort of scientific degree course anywhere in the world. It's just a marvel of clarity and concision and good sense. He starts with the small and goes to the large. He starts with the familiar and goes to the abstract. And he shows how in this way you can sort of explain quite difficult concepts to a lay reader with very little problem. And so, of course, that is out there in the public domain, and that article is online in case people want to look it up. But the archives, the Haldane archives, hold so many letters, Sandy, from just regular people writing to him with some idea they've had about science, or something related to science. And Haldane would diligently, conscientiously try to write back to as many people as possible, laying out his explanation or his advice or his ideas in extremely lucid language. These were just letters that were dashed off to people.
And this is not email. This is the age of writing it out by hand.
These were letters. I mean, these were letters, during the Second World War, when he was agitating for better air raid safety in Britain. He would get letters from people with sometimes wackadoo ideas for air raid safety, sometimes quite interesting ideas, truck drivers in Australia, people in Shanghai. And he would write back to these people with, with the same kind of clear, concise prose that he used in his articles. And they're just a delight to read.
It sounds extraordinary. I mean, he probably didn't sleep very much either, given the amount of letter writing that he was doing. Well, I mean, I just think he was this whole business about the politics and the thing you started out with of him basically experimenting in an almost fatal way on himself to support a government that he was vociferously haranguing at every opportunity is absolutely extraordinary. And some of the quotes you have in the book from the MI5 files on him are really interesting, because he must have been really boring for them to follow, because he really never did anything very contentious, but was very vociferous.
No, that's true. I mean, he would give speeches, and the speeches were all sort of in the public domain, so to speak. They were not cloak and dagger meetings with spies to hand over, the Admiralty's plans or whatever they may be. But MI5 kept tabs on him for close to 20 years. The minute they knew that he was sort of a left-leaning figure, I think, as was customary in the day, they would start a file on you. And of course, after he became a communist, there were huge suspicions that he might be a spy for the Soviet Union. They couldn't ever prove it, and he wasn't, in my opinion, a spy, although these things are difficult to tell at a remove of 70 years. But their surveillance of him essentially consisted of tapping the phones of the Communist Party headquarters on King Street in London, bugging the room so that if he came to visit, or if anybody came to visit the headquarters, they would have a transcript of the conversation. And of course, opening his letters, opening his luggage every time he came back from a trip overseas, and going to his public meetings and trying to see what he was up to over there. And unfortunately, as you say, the answer was always not very much. He was quite happy
They must have been bored to tears, poor things.
The only advantage for them was, I guess, that he was quite an interesting figure to follow. I mean, there's one incident I write about in the book where he was leading this public meeting and speaking at it during the Second World War. It was almost as if he started a small mini revolution by himself at that moment, because he was asking his crowd to follow him to the German embassy. And so they were hot on his heels. The entire thing was broken up by the police at some point, but it was very funny for me to think about JBS at the head of a crowd, brandishing the ideological equivalent of pitchforks, headed to the German embassy to try to show their dislike of the Nazis.
Of fascism. Well, he was quite an imposing man as well. He was quite a large man, wasn't he?
He was. I mean, he was huge, and he had a big bald head. He lost most of his hair in his early 20s, and he had a big mustache to go with it. And he was always sort of wearing these baggy, dowdy clothes, which he was told off for quite often, especially when he went to the Soviet Union late in the 1920s. But he was, and he had this deep booming voice. He could really command a room, and his lectures were packed. You mentioned dialectical materialism. He gave a talk, I found details about this. He gave a talk about a dialectical approach to biology. And 200 people showed up for that, Sandy. This was in the 1930s, and he was giving talks with difficult sounding titles, and he would attract a couple of hundred people to come down there and hear him speak. He was extremely popular.
Completely larger than life. It's interesting as well, because his whole experience in the First World War, the Second World War, you talked about the Second World War, but the First World War, it's almost like he found that he liked, it's almost like he found he liked power and the ability to lead. And then he, instead of what often happened to people after that kind of experience in those wars, is they would come back and be completely unfitted, because the myth is sort of you do well in the war and you come back to civilian society and you can't fit in and it just doesn't work. But what he did is seem to have taken that experience and just basically translated it into his whole life.
Right. I mean, he was one of the few people, I think, who after the First World War ended claimed that he had loved the experience. He liked being in the trenches. And you know, and he not only was he in the trenches, but he wrote his first scientific paper in the trenches. It must be the one of a kind. But this has a lot to do with him, JBS himself. I mean, JBS, as a young boy, as a young man, was bullied, didn't always fit in, was sort of neither here nor there throughout Eton and then Oxford. But then in the trenches, he somehow found this kind of camaraderie and the classless society that he and his father thought they wanted. And he really took to it. And the men looked up to him because he was a leader of a small bomb squadron. And so when he came out of the war, he'd been injured twice. Nonetheless, he came out really having sort of found himself and found a new confidence in himself because of the experience. But he also, I think the First World War was formative in the sense that that was when he realized most vividly that science and politics were united, was because he was among the people who experienced gas warfare for the very first time.
Yeah.
And when clouds of chlorine gas would blow over the Western Front, he and several others who were fighting in Flanders at the time were among the people to experience it. And I think he realized at that point that science was very quickly being put to the uses of warring politicians. And that was a ground truth that you can't escape from.
But then it was also kind of that sort of whole, I mean, I think his experience of being gassed in the trenches probably might have been different had his father not experimented with people's lungs in the first place.
Right, right, exactly. Yeah, because his father was, his specialty was respiration and physiology. And so his father was called up to France as well to do some experiments with gas masks. Yeah, gas masks. And JBS once again was roped in as a volunteer. So they would sort of put gas masks on and then try to run through clouds of chlorine gas, and they would test different gas masks based on this. And so this left him with sort of quite a cough. And when he returned to the front, he was still coughing and panting and unable to breathe. And so he wasn't able to run back to the front quite as quickly as he would have liked, which kind of saved him in a way, because a bomb exploded right in front of him and injured him severely, but the bomb might have landed right on top of him if he had been able to run faster than he was able to.
It's extraordinary that, I mean, he had almost like a charmed life. I mean, I just can't get the picture out of my head of having a sidekick that's your own son doing daft experiments with your own life. It's just, so you think of him as being a sidekick. You open the book with talking about Lysenko and Lysenkoism and Haldane's support for Lysenkoism. And I wasn't sure, and we talked about it a bit earlier, is had he met Nikolai Vavilov, who's actually one of my absolute heroes, Nikolai Vavilov, the man who tried to save the Soviet Union's food supply, but yet was starved to death in a Stalinist prison. Ironically, terrible. But had he met Vavilov, and it seemed like he kind of fell away from Lysenko in a way, but not in a way where he actually ever said, this guy's bonkers.
Right. Haldane did meet Vavilov, actually. Vavilov invited Haldane to the Soviet Union for a month of touring and lecturing in the late 1920s. And so he was there. The one time Haldane went to the Soviet Union was on Vavilov's invitation. And so they spent a lot of time together over there. Vavilov threw parties for him. Haldane delivered lectures in Moscow and Leningrad, and he went to Vavilov's experimental farm. He went to the seed bank, the famous seed bank that was then subsequently under siege during World War II. And he liked Vavilov, and he admired Vavilov's work a lot as well. Vavilov, as we know, in the early 1940s, falls prey to the kind of politicking that happens in science and genetics, in particular in the Soviet Union. And the architect of that downfall was Lysenko. And so Lysenko was this agronomist who believed that he had found a different model of genetics in which acquired characteristics could be inherited through subsequent generations. And he claimed that he was able to induce in this way changes in wheat and other grains that would transform the Soviet Union, transform agriculture and feed the entire nation. Unfortunately, his sort of ideological fixation with a kind of Stalinist or communist genetics meant that he eventually went on to decry or to deny the existence of things like the chromosome. And he thought Haldane's brand of genetics, which is a very kind of mathematically inclined genetics, that was completely useless and futile and told you nothing. And Lysenko was also the architect of this big purge in 1948 of geneticists and botanists and biologists that was carried out at his instance in the Soviet Union. And so Haldane, I think, and I fix upon this incident because Haldane, this was one instance when Haldane was genuinely, I think, torn between his scientific integrity and his political loyalty. And this was the one and only instance that I could find that he made the wrong choice. Publicly, he chose to defend Lysenko and Lysenkoist genetics, even though he did so in extremely tenuous ways, because he felt that the cause was larger than that. And for a scientist like Haldane to be seen decrying Lysenko would undermine the communist cause. And so he did this publicly, but privately, as I found while researching this book, he was extremely vocal about his opinion within the party. And he was constantly urging the British Communist Party to decry Lysenko and to take a stance against Stalinist genetics. And so I think there was this genuine conflict within him, which made this entire incident, a sort of inflection point and quite a unique episode in Haldane's life, where he decided for once, unfortunately, to not listen to his own scientific temper.
Mm-hmm. And I found it also interesting that his wife, Charlotte, his first wife, Charlotte, is
That's
that
right.
the name? Charlotte had gone to the Soviet Union without him, and had seen the purges starting to happen and had seen the way that Vavilov was being treated, and came back and said, "This is terrible. This is terrible." You know, our friend Vavilov,
right.
But yet JBS sort of, there was a like a kind of mask there that he didn't want to see. He didn't want to see it.
He didn't listen. And, you know, part of the reason, of course, was that Charlotte and JBS were on the outs by then already.
Mm-hmm.
Their marriage was breaking up. And I think, you know, the fact that she would come and tell him these things might, in fact, have made him even more stubbornly a supporter of Stalin and the Soviet Union.
Sort of digging.
He was that kind of guy. He was a, you know, he was a contrarian. One of his friends said that if JBS had happened to be born in the Soviet Union, he would have been the bluest blooded of Tories. It's just the kind of person that he was, just like anti-establishment wherever you are.
Whichever establishment happens to be in power.
Exactly.
Yeah, so there's a very famous quote that everyone always attributes to Haldane, which is if the creator had been, if there was a creator, he would have been inordinately fond of beetles. And you say in the book, you can't find any evidence that he actually said that.
It sounds like such a JBS thing to say. You know, it's clever, and it has to, you know, it's clever and it's simultaneously agnostic and dismisses the creator in a single sort of, you know, single word. At the same time, I can't find the original source for it. I don't think it exists, or if it does, it was sort of circulated by word of mouth first before it was finally put down in print by some third party.
He said it at a meeting somewhere or something, and then someone remembered it and it passed and passed. So it may have been quite different when it started out. You never know, because things do change as they kind of go through time, don't they? I want to ask, you know, because we're getting towards the end, but I wanted to ask about his time in India, and because he spent the latter years of his life in India, in Calcutta, at the Genetics Institute, variously battling with people in his usual kind of way. But do you think he chose India because he had so enjoyed being in India early on in his life, or did he choose going to India because it was very different, or why do you think he moved to India?
Again, a number of reasons, one of which was some of the sordid details of just money. I think he was in UCL after the war in the 1950s, and he found that both the university and himself were running out of money quite quickly. UCL was trying to rebuild several of its buildings, so research funds were not forthcoming. Haldane found himself paying out of pocket for both research, but also for something as simple as a set of teaspoons for the common room. He himself was paying alimony on his first marriage. and wasn't making as much money, I think, as he would have liked. And it was, I happened to stumble upon a shoebox full of his bank statements, and you could see that he was sort of in the red month after month. It was quite clear that he was having problems with money. And so this offer came up in India, and India's was and continues to be a cheap place to live and work, but the money was quite good. And so he decided to move out there. He'd been there once before. He liked the country a lot. He was quite fascinated by sort of its literature and philosophy. But more than anything else also, I think after the Lysenko episode, he had sort of gathered a distaste for British communists, which meant that his close sort of political affiliations had all melted away in the UK. And he might have been looking for another big cause to get behind. And at that time, India was, and still is to some extent, quite a socialist or a statist state, extremely welfare oriented, centrally planned. So there was sort of, the economy was quite tightly controlled, not so much as it was in the Soviet Union, and not as brutally, definitely. But still, at the time, Nehru, whom he had met a couple of times, Jawaharlal Nehru was an extremely sort of hands-on prime minister, and he was extremely socialist in his outlook. And so I think India, to him, seemed to be a new kind of social experiment in which science would play a big role in determining what the course of the nation would be. In the same way that the Soviet Union was exactly the same kind of big social experiment a few decades earlier. And so if he had grown a little disillusioned with the Soviet Union, I think India was still fresh and new and interesting and promising. And so he decided he would move there.
And Indian science was very much on the ascendancy at that time as well, wasn't it? I mean, it was very highly valued and supported.
Right, and there were a number of Simon Haldane was one of the few who moved out there and lived there and died there. But there would be a rotating cast of scientists from the West and other parts of Asia who would come through and who would give lectures and who would consult on scientific projects. And there was a real sense of optimism about science in India at the time, even if the budgets weren't extraordinary, even if there wasn't sort of lavish amounts of money to spend on it as there were in Europe or the US. There was still a huge amount of optimism about what science could do for the common man. That was something that Haldane always believed in, that science ultimately had to benefit society, had to uplift the material conditions of men and women.
Yeah, I also thought, I thought one of the things that he said about being in Calcutta and being in the tropics and having that profusion of nature around him also was in a way inspirational about his genetics.
Right.
In a way, to be in a place where there was so much variety and so much, the products of evolution were so obviously diverse. That must
right.
be exciting as well.
Yeah, because I think Haldane moved there in 1957. He died in 1964. So he was there for 7 years. And, I think from the point of view of his biggest work or the most important work in genetics, all of that was already behind him by that point. But he was discovering sort of the pleasures of a more old school style of genetics, which is just sort of crossbreeding, hybridization, careful observation of plants and animals, organisms, and kind of trying to intuit genetic insights from that. And of course, he had a small but extremely committed and dedicated group of students whom he would shepherd towards their PhDs. So I think he quite enjoyed doing science in that vein during the last 7 years of his life.
Well, it's also in a way he went back to his roots, because in his early days he worked at John Innes hybridizing plants and doing that kind of genetics. So in a way he kind of went back to what he had done earlier on in his life.
And even before that, when he was a boy, he and his sister would raise guinea pigs and rats and breed them with each other and try to sort of come up with insights in genetics. His first paper, co-written with his sister, was based exactly on that kind of experiment, where he talked about linkages in mammals. So it's a complete throwback to what he was doing in the early 1900s.
Well, it's quite, It's just what a fascinating man and what a fascinating life. And I urge anybody who hasn't read, I have all these marks in here, which I was going to ask questions about, but we've talked about only a few of those things. We could go on talking for hours and hours, but I think I'm going to open it up for questions now because we have about 8 minutes left. And there are some questions in the questions and some questions in the chat. So if people could put questions in the question and answer bit, then it's slightly easier. But Gail Cardew has asked, was Haldane involved in the eugenics movement, and what were his opinions on this? And we kind of touched on this a bit when we talked about Fisher, and,
Right.
and my observation that people often confuse Haldane and Fisher.
Right.
But what was Haldane's view on eugenics and Fisherian types of genetics?
Right. So Haldane was very strongly against the kind of eugenics measures that were being put into place both in the US and the UK back then. As he was against Nazi theories of eugenics. So, for example, American programs of sterilization of quote unquote undesirable people, he was heavily critical of that. The British program where they sort of isolated and prevented from, prevented, I guess, again, undesirable people from reproducing. There were about 60,000 people who went through this program. He was heavily critical of that. And of course, as I said, he was heavily critical of Nazi race theories and constantly wrote about just how wrong they were. Having said this, so in the 1910s and the 1920s, I think he came into those decades bearing some of the unexamined prejudices of a white man of his class, which is that he did think initially that race was, there was some kind of construct called race, even if it wasn't the one that people popularly imagined it to be. I think that would correspond more closely to what we know today as population groups. And I think he was sort of using those terms synonymously. And he was also, he also had, again, ideas of his age of sort of what constituted progress in civilization and what constituted an advanced society and a society that was not quite as advanced. And these overlaid, unfortunately, quite closely with society, social groups that were based on race. So for example, he would think that the Aborigines of Australia were not an advanced civilization, were not an advanced social group. But through the 1920s and into the 1930s, and definitely by the end of the 1930s, he abandoned all of these views. And he sort of revised again and again based on his own findings of genetics, as well as other people's findings of what genetics tells you about race. He abandoned all of these, and by the end of the 1930s, he was quite clear about the fact that race as a construct was futile. It didn't exist. There was no such thing as race. And every kind of eugenicist proposal that was based on racial theory was completely false.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's quite interesting that he changed his views a lot, and a lot of times we focus on a particular period in someone's career or life and assume that they don't change, but most people do change a lot over time. I mean, Fisher changed in the opposite direction, really.
Right. Fisher grew more and more sort of convinced of the value of eugenics, and Haldane grew less and less convinced of it until he was sort of writing about it quite vociferously throughout the 1940s and onwards.
Of course, influenced by Nazi Germany. There's a couple of questions here in the box. Somebody's asked, did Haldane believe that science supported his political beliefs? Kind of the opposite of my question about Diamat and science is, did the science support his politics? Did he believe that?
It's difficult to say. I mean, because as I said, he was quite clear that his own scientific work shouldn't be influenced by his politics. So the sort of the experiments he did or the theories he worked on, none of these should be impacted in any way by dialectical materialism. But he found some commonalities in sort of the material source of life on Earth, the material source of evolution, sort of how genes change, for example. He found some kind of commonality between that and Marx's own ideas of the material source of changes in society. But these were very, very broad resonances. I don't think they were I don't think he outlined any particular detailed concordances between his science and his politics.
Didn't he talk about mutations and discontent and kind of upheavals and?
Right. And I think that too, again, I think it was sort of, along very broad lines. He would kind of put this out partly as an intellectual or propagandistic exercise in his effort to show people that socialism and communism and Marxism were all valid philosophies.
Yeah, so Daryl's asked the question is, we were talking about compartmentalization of science and how people are kind of channelized very early on. Aren't moves toward interdisciplinary academic departments and institutes, such as the ones at Imperial College or MIT, a good step away from the kind of compartmentalization that we were talking about? And I mean, I know I have a view on that, but I'd like to hear yours.
I think absolutely. I mean, I think that's it's exactly the kind of thing that Haldane would have recommended himself. And the more that happens, I think the better.
Yeah, I think interdisciplinarity is really interesting, because sometimes what we call interdisciplinarity now is actually very narrow. It's even narrower. Right. It's narrower than Haldane's type of interdisciplinarity. So you wouldn't necessarily have a classicist in the Grantham Institute, for example, at Imperial College.
Right.
So I think the humanities. It's the humanities. I mean, because I come from a liberal arts education in the United States, and I would never have. I mean, I'm very, very glad I had that opportunity and experience to be able to do that, because I think it's made my science better.
Right. I mean, I think like there's so much in science. I mean, the social effects of science, the ethics of science. I mean, all of this is really sort of best thought of from the prism of the humanities. And this is something that perhaps people don't give enough thought to in this day and age, or maybe people don't focus on that much.
It's kind of the context in a way. And I wonder, and the last thing and there's a comment says, no question, just to say thanks for such an interesting talk covering the wider aspects of a person's life and work. And I just wonder, in today's world, where politics is perhaps not as polarized, everybody's more middle of the road, would a government employ someone like Haldane, who was that different to them, to do things like experiment on himself with submarines?
Sandy, I don't think you would get a security clearance.
I don't think so either. I don't think so either.
I think MI5.
That's sad.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, MI5 would, I think, put the kibosh on that immediately. No way he's going to get to sort of, write reports for the Admiralty or read research, from the military. I think it would just be completely ruled out.
Okay, here's another question. A couple of things saying, isn't it amazing? But here's one. Professor Samanth, don't you think most of the time the adjunct inspiration that comes for the introduction of philosophy was, as the case with Charles Darwin, who wrote a letter to Ibsen, which is worth quoting, or by Irwin, a Nobel laureate in physics, in his book What is Life? So about that kind of concatenation of things. Right.
I mean, I didn't know about this letter from Darwin to Ibsen. I would love to read it. Actually, I'm very curious to.
A message from Professor Dua. It's from Chandigarh in India.
Yeah, I'm not sure what that letter is, but I'd love to read it. But
probably digitized,
I'm sure it is. What is Life is actually is sort of one of these fascinating and again sort of slightly interdisciplinary books. This question of sort of Schrödinger trying to explain the biological basis of life through his knowledge of physics. It's a short lecture. I think he gave the lecture in Dublin, and then he put it down in the form of a book. But it's again sort of one of these amazing lateral thinking exercises of the kind that Haldane would have loved himself.
Yeah, and I think Robert Oppenheimer, person we were talking about a bit earlier, Robert Oppenheimer was another one of these people who was very, very classically educated,
right,
and used quotations from the classics a lot. I mean, right. I am heart a destroyer of worlds,
right,
as he was his comment on
right.
the test of the atomic bomb, which and that kind of thing. I mean, much more so, I think, in the United States than in Britain, was actually very much frowned upon after the Second World War, was that crossover between the humanities and the sciences. It was almost as if there ought to be a sort of a divide. There's a question here about saying, can't wait to read the book, and I can't recommend it enough. It's absolutely amazing. And what was the interaction with Helen Spurway like in terms of their shared or converging science?
So Helen was initially a graduate student who worked under him at UCL. And then they subsequently got married after his divorce got finalized. And so Helen found herself, at least while they were still in the UK, and this was another reason why they wanted to move to India, but while they were still in the UK, Helen found it difficult to find an academic position for herself. So she quite often ended up being a de facto assistant to JBS. And one of the things that attracted JBS and Helen to India was the promise of an academic position for Helen as well. And Helen was even more than Haldane. I think Helen was the one who spearheaded a lot of the observational and hybridizational kind of science that Helen and Haldane and the rest of their students did in India. I think she was much more interested in this kind of science and was able to derive a lot more from it than he did. And so I think it was only in India that their research interests eventually overlapped, because I think right up until the 1950s, Haldane would largely work in genetics out of mathematical theory, which is something that only he understood, or he and very few other people understood. And Helen wasn't the kind of person who would work in that way.
She was much more of a natural historian, wasn't she?
Yes.
She was much more,
She is.
So there, someone is asking to read 3 lines from the Ibsen letter to Charles Darwin, but I'm not sure I can unmute people. I'm not sure. Can I do that, Padma? I don't know how to do that. Padma's in charge. Padma's in charge of the webinar.
I'm going to allow him to talk. Hold on one second.
That would be great if we could read those 3 lines, and then I think we probably should call it an evening. Although I think we could probably talk about JBS and the book and the times for hours, because he's such an interesting person, such a wonderful Professor Dua, please do go ahead and read those lines.
He writes in that letter, he says, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yes.
Yeah. We always keep the dearest thing to ourselves. He wrote in his beautiful letter of appreciation to Ibsen. He says that this habitual withholding of gratitude is a perennial tragedy of human relationship. And this interpersonal tragedy has broader cultural reverberation. The more I live, the more convinced I become that great friendship are the heartstrings of creative culture, productive science, the wings that lift artists, scientists, and dogma disruption above the cesspool of criticism, contention, politics, and indifference with every groundbreaking creative act of the mind.
So there's a bit of a separation between politics and science.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Well, that's really very interesting. Isabel, thank you very much, Professor Dua. That was really interesting. We'll have to see if we can find that. Isabel Secord has asked, where can we buy this book? Sounds fascinating. It is published by, I can't remember now. Wait a minute. I got it off Amazon, actually. Atlantic Books in London.
That's right.
And at all good bookstores. It's actually in my local bookstore. It's in my local bookstore.
Good. I'm so glad.
And I told them it was excellent book and that they should put it on the front shelf. Although nobody can go into the bookstore, but if it's in the window, then people will buy it. And I would urge everybody to read it because it's absolutely fascinating. And what a person. And a story beautifully told, Samanth. And thank you so much for coming on this evening and for writing such an amazing book about someone who's important to all of us who are interested in the natural world. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm so glad you enjoyed it. Thank you all for coming.
Wonderful. Thanks everybody for coming. Thank you.